So let us hear then from Congressman Scott, and then later in the day from Representative Davis. Let me do an introduction, Congressman, if I might. Thank you. I want to make sure I stick to my marching orders because I want to be invited back. Congressman Robert C. Bobby Scott is currently serving his 12th term in Congress. Prior to serving in the House of Representatives, he served in the Virginia House of Delegates from 1978 to 1983, and in the Senate of Virginia from 1983 to 1993. Congressman Scott has the distinction of being the first African-American elected to Congress from the Commonwealth of Virginia since Reconstruction, and only the second African-American elected to Congress in Virginia's history. Having a maternal grandfather of Filipino ancestry also gives him the distinction of being the first American with Filipino ancestry to serve as a voting member of Congress. In Congress, Congressman Scott is known as a champion of the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights, fighting to protect the rights and civil liberties of all Americans. Congressman Scott co-chaired with Congressman Sensenbrenner the Task Force on Overcriminalization in 2014. As a result of that extensive work, they introduced the Safe Justice Act. We're so pleased to have you here with us today, Congressman. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Davey, for your very kind remarks, and thank you for all the work that you do. I'm delighted that to be here, and regret that my colleague Jim Sensenbrenner couldn't be here. We wish him well. You know, I serve as the ranking member on the Committee on Education and Workforce. I spent most of my career on both the Education and Judiciary committees. And so I tell young people when I talk to them that I'm going to see you one way or the other. You can take advantage of my good work on the Education and Workforce Committee, or if you don't like that message, we lock up more people in the United States proportionally than any country on earth by far. So one way or the other, we're going to see you. I just want to commend Congressman Davis for all the work that he's done. He has been a consistent advocate for reentry and those with criminal histories, trying to reintegrate back into the community. He has just been a relentless advocate and sponsor of the Second Chance Act. And Jim Sensenbrenner, who worked with on the Judiciary Committee, a leader in taking an evidence-based approach to crime. I know that April 24th kicked off National Reentry Week. This is an opportunity for lawmakers to examine efforts to support formerly incarcerated individuals' successful entry into society, and this is a time to explore what we can do on a evidence-based basis to see what works and what doesn't work. Now, we got a lot of work to do. According to Sentencing Project, as many as 1 in 3 Americans have some kind of criminal record, and more than 600,000 leave state and federal prisons every year. Millions twirl through the jail system every year. Too many of these are incarcerated because of simple-minded laws like the ones we passed in 1994 in the crime bill, which just loaded up a bunch of slogans and sound bites, stapled them together, called it a crime bill, and now we're finally figuring out that some of that just wasn't a good idea. A lot of those people who were given draconian sentences after the 1994 crime bill are finally getting released. Now that's difficult because, as you know, a criminal record makes it hard to get hired. That's why I joined Congressman Davis and Congressman Cummings and others to introduce a bipartisan bill, the Fair Chance in Hiring bill, that essentially codifies ban the box. I don't have to explain to anybody in here what ban the box means, but 22 states and 100 localities have taken steps to ban the box. A lot of corporations, private corporations, have also followed suit. Studies have confirmed that if a person coming out of prison gets a job, they're much less likely to come back. If they don't get a job, they're much more likely to come back. So we have an interest in seeing that they get considered. Now, one of the problems is once you check the box, the chances of you getting hired are diminished because your application essentially gets ignored. When we know that if you do an individualized assessment of the criminal history, if it's a long time ago, we know that after a certain length, you regress back to the point where your chance of messing up again are the same as the general population. We know some offenses aren't serious, and if you can just get an opportunity to explain yourself, to show what you've got, the employer might well say, well, you're the most qualified person I've interviewed for this position by far, and I'm not going to let a 20-year-old marijuana charge mess up my opportunity to get the best person. You wouldn't have gotten the interview if you had checked the box. Now, the EEOC has been helpful in this because they have issued guidance that the box or a blanket prohibition against hiring people based on criminal record without any individual assessment has a disparate impact. And there's an old case, Griggs versus Duke Power Company, that found that if you have a disparate impact with no relationship to the job, that constitutes illegal employment discrimination. And so in that case, they were requiring high school diplomas. All the whites had high school diplomas, none of the blacks had high school diplomas. And requiring the high school diploma had nothing to do with your ability to be a custodian. And so the requirement for a diploma, unless you can show that it had some relationship to your ability to do the job, was just gratuitous racial discrimination and violated Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. They're saying the same thing now about a blanket prohibition on criminal records, because unless you can show that the criminal record has some relationship to the job, the disparate impact just constitutes employment discrimination. So if you got one of those boxes that essentially creates a blanket prohibition on hiring without any individual assessment of how the offense could affect your ability to do the job, a decades-old minor violation has no relationship to you to do with nothing to do with the job. Now, if it's stealing, you're trying to be a bank teller, or sex molestation, and you're trying to be a daycare worker, has some relationship to the job. But otherwise, all it is employment discrimination. And so when we talk to cities and towns and corporations about whether or not they ought to ban the box, I tell people to ask the city attorney to advise the city council on the effect of the EEOC guidance on a continuation of that little box. The city attorney might tell them that all that box does is tease you up for an employment discrimination class action, and you might want to erase it and deal with criminal record later in the process. But since that guidance, a lot of companies have read it and figured out that they don't want to tee themselves up like that and have banned the box. We're trying to do the same thing in housing, where a felony record denies you otherwise your right to housing. We're trying to make sure that the federal government becomes a model employer with federal employees and contractors, things we have control over, also ban the box. But one of the things I'm delighted with this process is that you have taken an evidence-based approach. And that is something that you don't find a lot of around Congress. Basically, it's a slogan-based approach. And basically, when you do crime policy, you have a choice. You can reduce crime and usually save money, or you can play politics. And we're good at both. And you got all these slogans, 3 strikes and you're out, mandatory minimum sentences, and get it to rhyme, it's even better. If you do the adult crime, you do the adult time. Now, that little thing has been studied, and we have concluded that it will increase the crime rate because you stick a young child in prison, or you can stick a young child in a situation where the judge can order psychological services, education, even family services. Guess what? After a year of those, guess who's more likely to be back in trouble? So we know that some of these slogans not only do nothing, some of them actually add to crime. But they're popular and they find their way into crime bills. One of the things that Jim Sensenbrenner and I did with the Overcriminalization Task Force is we tried to get evidence. And one of the pieces of evidence we found was what happened in Texas when they were faced with a $2 billion prison construction request to keep up with their growing prison population. $2 billion, one state alone, $2 billion. And somebody said, wow, $2 billion. Well, you know, if you spent just about $200 million in prevention, early intervention, and rehabilitation, maybe you wouldn't have to spend all $2 billion for prison construction. And when they did that, they found that not only did they not have to build any new prisons, they ended up closing some of the prisons they had. Now, that created a lot of support for prevention, early intervention, and rehabilitation, because what you had was a coalition of people that thought that was the right thing to do for the people, and another group that looked at $2 billion they saved and said, you know how much tax cutting you can do with $2 billion? Well, everybody, for whatever reason, now is supporting prison reform, and if we can do that without the slogans and sound bites, we can make a lot of progress. So we created the Safe Justice Act, which is comprehensive reform, starting with investments in prevention, early intervention, the getting primary prevention, getting young kids on the right track and keep them on the right track, and then police training. Whatever your views are on the police shootings, when you get down to the end, the solution is going to be police training and possibly body cameras. Okay, we put money in that. If you get to that point and don't have any money, all that argument and debate has been worthless, so we put police. Then we have diversion from jail pretrial. Unnecessary pretrial detention just messes up people. They lose their job, they lose their apartment, just waiting for trial. They're found not guilty, but you know, all of a sudden they're homeless and more likely to commit crimes. Try to avoid pretrial detention if possible. When you get to court, try to use drug courts to deal with underlying problems rather than convict them, jail them, let them get out, same condition they were in, going back and forth. Anybody who's been to a drug court graduation knows how powerful they are in changing people's lives. The main part of it is a substantial reduction in mandatory minimums. We got all these mandatory minimums for drug crimes. We eliminate virtually all of them. Maintaining, I wanted to get rid of all of them, but we got rid of all of them except for the kingpins. And so there is a substantial reduction in mandatory minimums, generating huge savings that can be diverted to pay for the prevention, early intervention, the police training, the drug courts, the prison rehabilitation in prison, and plenty of money for second chance programs after they get out. The fact that it's comprehensive and you have cost savings means you can pay for all the stuff that's in there. If you don't have a pay for, then you're sitting up here with all these good ideas with no money to actually do them. But the fact is that we went through a process where we only considered those things for which there was evidence, experience, state experience, facts that led us to believe that it would actually reduce crime and probably save money. This is in stark contrast to the way that other bills come up. They say, well, what can we pass? And then I give you a little of this, you give me a little of that, and then we all come to the press conference patting each other on the back about how bipartisan we are, and you look up, and some of these bills floating around have enhanced mandatory minimums, new mandatory minimums, fight the war on drugs by increasing penalties for heroin, and then when you've expanded the mandatory minimums and reduced the mandatory minimums, you're not sure that the problem of mass incarceration has been helped or even hurt. There used to be a time when everybody on the good side of this issue took the position that the only way to get good stuff passed is to hook it up with some simple-minded foolishness, because you know those guys are going to pass that. And if you want the Boys and Girls Clubs funding, just hook up with that, and although we don't like that, it's going to pass, and we get the Boys and Girls Clubs funding. If you can reduce the 20-year mandatory minimum in the bill to a 10-year mandatory minimum, you know, you've done well. and get a little prevention funding in there, and you go along with it. Well, I think about 10 years ago, a lot of these groups started with a different approach. They said going slower in the wrong direction is not progress. And so we need to make sure that we take an evidence approach. We don't have to accept all the bad stuff and foolishness. And I mean, when a bill expands mandatory minimums, it's hard to take it seriously. And some of the bills floating around, other than the Safe Justice Act, actually expand mandatory. They reduce the mandatory minimums, then vastly expand the number of people that get it, so that undoubtedly more people will be going to jail under mandatory minimums. And the question is, you do the prison bed year calculation, did you help mass incarceration or not? You don't know. But this group, in doing the second chance evaluation, did a study based on research. And for that kind of approach, you've taken you're going to reduce crime and save money or play politics. You have taken the research-based approach where you know you can reduce crime and probably save money. And for that, I want to thank you for leading the charge, and hope we can talk some of my colleagues into taking the same kind of approach. Thank you very much.